that suggests virtual schooling can be damaging to children's mental health. According to the survey, nearly 25% of parents whose children received virtual or hybrid instruction reported deteriorating mental health in their child. That's compared to just 16% of parents whose children received in-person instruction. For more, let's bring in Randi Weingarten. She is the president of the American Federation of Teachers. Randi, there's a lot to discuss, but first, how are reopenings going nationwide so far? What's working, what's not, what still needs to be improved?
So, first off, thank you for having me. And, because of the vaccines, I can actually start traveling again and seeing people in person, in many of our districts, which is what we're starting to do right now. But right now, about 80% of school districts are now reopened for in-person learning. About 90% of school kids, K through 5, have the option for in-person learning. And in the districts that I represent, it's about 95% of those districts are now reopened for in-person learning. All of that is really great news because we know that in-person learning is critical for kids. And the fight all of last year was, meaning, all of this past school year has been how do you make it safe so that the entire education community feels safe. And I give Joe Biden a lot of credit because what he did was made sure that the CDC gave us guidance to do that. And he and the Congress gave us the resources, not only for what we need to do right now, but a real down payment on what we need to do to help address long-term kids' social, emotional, and academic needs, and to support teachers in doing that.
Randi, you recently pushed back on the CDC's new social distancing guidelines for schools from 6 feet to 3. Why?
Because, because trust is actually earned, and we have a lot of experts that we've used, including Dr. Michael Osterholm and others, who were very concerned about making sure that if we were having more kids in a classroom, do we actually have the kind of ventilation needs, particularly in the districts that I am most worried about, the districts that serve a majority Black and brown kids that have been through much austerity and disinvestment so that they don't have the ventilation systems that were necessary. So we had just gotten these systems reopened with 6 feet physical distancing, and we really need to have studies in these districts that show that 3 feet will be okay. Now, what has happened since that point, and I give the CDC a lot of credit, is that they and the Ed Department has been saying that in order to move to 3 feet, you still have to do all those other layered mitigation, including ventilation. And I was really concerned, I'll put it on myself, that in a place like Chicago or LA, where there's been so much distrust and fear, and there's so much COVID, we didn't want there to be backsliding. We need more space and we need better ventilation systems. But I think that there's been a lot of really good work in districts across the country saying, let's make sure we have the layered mitigation that's necessary if we're going to have more kids in classrooms, and let's make sure that we do cafeterias right and we make sure that the hallways are right so that kids are not spilling all over each other.
According to a recent government survey, there are visible racial disparities in which schools are actually opening full-time. Just look at these numbers. Almost half of white fourth graders attended school in person in January, while most students of color, nearly 60%, learned remotely. It's a similar story for Hispanic fourth graders. The gap is even wider for Asians. Randi, what are your thoughts on this, and how do we make reopenings more equitable?
So what's happened, there's two things that have happened here that get these terrible disparities. Number one is the issue of trust, and number two is the issue of facilities. And so if you, the places that were the hardest to reopen were the places that had the worst conditions, that had the worst facilities. And so there, and those places tend to be places, unfortunately, where the majority of Black and brown kids go to school. I taught school in Brooklyn, New York. I taught at a school that had in central Brooklyn. Thankfully, that school had been fixed a few years ago, but it took a bond act to actually get that to happen, and so many cities don't have those kind of things. The second point is this, and we're getting that with Joe Biden's new infrastructure plan and with the Americans Rescue Plan that just happened. So the good news is that this president is really trying to attend to things that have been problems for years. The second issue is the trust of parents. You take in Chicago, for example, when they did a survey, 60% of white parents said they wanted their kids to go back to in-person, 30% of Black and brown parents. The COVID itself had hugely disproportionately affected Black and brown communities. There's more pre-existing conditions, health conditions in Black and brown communities, and there's been a lot of misinformation about what COVID does or doesn't do. And so we have to find ways to create trust with Black and brown parents that their schools are safe. And one of the best ways to do that, and we feel a real responsibility for this, is that when teachers and other education support personnel feel that schools are safe, that is a proxy to parents that schools are safe. And part and parcel of what we're trying to do is make sure that schools are safe so that parents see and trust it just like teachers see and trust it.
Randi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.